The Silent Harvest Extended Cut. The air in Blackwood Valley doesn't just sit, it suffocates. It carries the cloying scent of drying corn husks mixed with something metallic, like old copper coins or dried blood. I hadn't stepped foot on my grandparents' land in a decade, but the moment my tires hit the jagged gravel of the driveway, that old familiar knot of dread tightened in my gut. My grandfather, Elias, was waiting on the porch. He didn't offer a hug or a welcome home. He just stood there, his shadow long and thin in the dying light, pointing a calloused finger toward the north field. "The harvest is late this year, boy," he rasped, his eyes shadowed by a sweat-stained cap. "Stay inside once the shadows touch the porch. No matter what you hear, you don't go wandering." I tried to laugh it off as I hauled my bags inside. "It's just a farm, Grandpa. What's the corn gonna do? Outgrow me?" He didn't smile. He just latched the heavy iron bolt on the front door, a bolt that looked like it was designed to keep something powerful from pushing its way in. That first night, the silence was the loudest thing about the house. No crickets, no owls, just the rhythmic thrum of the wind through the stalks. I looked out from my upstairs window and counted the scarecrows. There were 3 in the north field when I arrived. By 1 a.m., there were 12. They weren't just standing, they were positioned in a semicircle, their burlap heads tilted at an impossible angle, all staring directly at my bedroom glass. The rules of the farm weren't suggestions, they were survival tactics. Grandpa had taped a yellowed piece of paper to the back of my door. 1. Never open the curtains after the sun sets. 2. If you hear scratching at the floorboards, whistle a loud, cheerful tune until it fades. 3. If you hear your mother's voice calling from the corn, remember she's been buried in the churchyard for 5 years. I spent the second night shivering under the covers, listening to the sound of dry, straw-filled limbs scraping against the siding of the house. It sounded like 1,000 nails on a chalkboard. On the third night, the curiosity became a poison. I heard a soft, rhythmic thudding coming from the porch, the sound of heavy boots. I broke the first rule. I gingerly peeled back the corner of the heavy wool curtain. A scarecrow was standing on the porch, inches from the glass. It wasn't stuffed with hay. It was wearing a faded blue flannel shirt, the exact one my cousin Leo was wearing the day he ran away 3 years ago. The burlap skin of the scarecrow's neck was pulsing, a slow, wet throb, as if a heart was struggling to beat beneath the layers of twine and rot. I backed away, tripping over a loose floorboard, and that's when I saw the trap door under my bed. I pried it open, hoping for a way out, but found only a row of empty burlap masks, each with a name stitched into the neck: Elias, Martha, Leo, and at the very end of the row, a fresh, clean mask with my name embroidered in red thread. I realized then that my grandfather wasn't a farmer tending to crops. He was a shepherd tending to a flock of monsters. The corn didn't feed the town fed the corn. As the front door bolt slowly slid open from the outside, I realized why the harvest was late. It was waiting for the final piece of the puzzle. It was waiting for me. The barn that breathes. We bought the Miller estate for a price that should have been our first warning. Nestled in the sagging hills of the valley, the farmhouse was charming enough, but it was the great red barn that dominated the horizon. It sat at the edge of the property like a hulking, silent god. The neighbors didn't come over with pies or welcome mats. Instead, an old man from the adjacent plot stopped his tractor by our fence, spat into the dirt, and said only one thing: sleep in the house, keep the cattle in the field, and for the love of God, never step inside that barn after the owls go quiet. We laughed about it over wine that first night. Local superstitions, Sarah said. though she kept glancing toward the darkened window. But by the second week, the laughter died. It started with the flies, thousands of them, thick and iridescent, swarming the barn's massive oak doors despite the autumn chill. Then came the moisture. A thick, viscous black liquid began seeping from the knots in the wood, smelling of iron and stagnant swamp water. It didn't just drip, it pulsed. One night, the wind died down completely, leaving a silence so heavy it made my ears ring. That's when I heard it. A low, rhythmic huff, huff, huff. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from the barn. It sounded like a giant pair of lungs expanding and contracting, the very timber of the building groaning with every breath. Our dog, Buster, refused to go within 50 yards of the structure, backing away with his hackles raised and a whimper that sounded far too human. Driven by a mix of fear and a need to protect our investment, I went to the cellar and found a box of old reel-to-reel tapes left by the previous owner, Mr. Miller. His voice was a thin, trembling reed. "It's not a building anymore," the recording hissed through the static. "It's a stomach. It settled here a century ago, and we built the wood around it to keep it contained. But wood rots. Wood fails. You have to feed it, or it starts reaching out. If you hear the thumping from the hayloft, it's already chosen its next meal." That night, the thumping started. A heavy, wet sound, like a slab of meat being dropped onto the floorboards. I looked out the window and saw the barn doors, which I had padlocked shut, swinging wide open. Not outward, but inward, like a mouth yawning. The black liquid was pouring out now, carving a path through the grass toward our back door. Sarah wasn't in bed. I found her in the kitchen, standing paralyzed, staring at the barn. She wasn't screaming. She was breathing in perfect synchronization with the building. Huff, huff, huff. I grabbed her hand to pull her away, but her skin felt like cold, wet grain. She turned to me, her eyes clouded over with that same black ink seeping from the barn walls. "It's so warm inside, Mark," she whispered, her voice vibrating with a timbre that didn't belong to her. "It's been empty for so long." As the barn let out a massive shuddering exhale that blew the kitchen door off its hinges, I realized the neighbors were wrong. We weren't supposed to stay out of the barn. The barn was already coming for us. The Cursed Cattle Bell. The job seemed like a godsend when I was down to my last $20. Old Man Silas ran a massive cattle ranch on the edge of the county, a place where the grass grew waist-high and the nearest neighbor was a 30-minute drive away. He was a man of few words, his face a map of deep-set wrinkles and sun-scorched skin. He led me to a small, weathered shack on the perimeter of the property and handed me a rusty set of keys. "Keep the fences patched and the troughs full," he grunted, his voice sounding like grinding stones. Then he pointed a shaking finger toward a massive, rusted iron bell hanging from a rotting timber post by the main gate. "That bell there," Silas said, his eyes narrowing. "Don't you ever touch it. Don't let the wind swing it, and for the love of all that's holy, don't you dare ring it after the sun goes down. If you do, the herd will come, and they won't be coming for grain." I nodded, thinking it was just the eccentricities of a man who'd spent too many years alone with cows. But as the weeks passed, the silence of the ranch began to feel heavy. The cattle were different here. They didn't graze. They stood in perfectly straight lines, their large black eyes following my truck as I drove past. They never moved. They just watched. One Tuesday night, a storm rolled in, the kind that turns the sky a bruised purple and makes the electricity hum in your teeth. I was restless, fueled by a cheap bottle of bourbon and the crushing boredom of the plains. I stood by the gate, the rain lashing at my face, looking at that rusted bell. What's the worst that could happen? I muttered, the alcohol clouding my judgment. I reached out and grabbed the heavy iron clapper. Clang! The sound was deeper than any bell should be, a vibrating, mournful wail that seemed to ripple through the very ground beneath my boots. The silence that followed was absolute. Then I heard it, a low, rhythmic thumping. Thousands of hooves hitting the wet earth at once. I scrambled back to my shack and locked the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the slats in the window, I saw them. The herd wasn't running, they were marching. Hundreds of cattle emerged from the darkness, but as they got closer to the porch light, I realized something was horribly wrong. Their legs were too long, their joints bending in ways that defied nature. They didn't have hooves anymore. They had pale, elongated fingers that scratched at the dirt as they moved. By midnight, my shack was surrounded. The cattle weren't grazing. They were standing on their hind legs, their massive heads pressed against my thin wooden walls. I could hear their breath, a wet, raspy sound that smelled of rotting grass and old meat. Then came the scratching, not at the door, but at the roof. Something heavy had climbed up there. A voice, distorted and echoing as if spoken through a throat full of gravel, drifted down through the chimney. "You rang the bell, boy. Now you have to lead the herd." I looked down at my own hands in the dim lamplight. My nail polish were turning black and hardening into something thick and sharp. My skin was thickening into a coarse gray hide. I tried to scream, but all that came out was a low, guttural lowing. Outside, the bell began to ring again, but this time, nobody was pulling the rope. The bell was ringing itself, summoning the rest of us into the dark. I realized then why Silas was so old and so tired. He wasn't the owner of the ranch. He was just the last one who hadn't been harvested yet.